Hello gem hunters. In today's video we're going to talk about those beautiful gemstones known as rubies. But first, let me ask you a question. If you found a ruby in the wild, would you be able to identify it? If you're not, this video is for you. But why would anyone be interested in finding rubies in the wild? Well, in case you didn't know, rubies are highly prized gemstones in the jewelry market. So when we hear about rubies, we think of spectacular, faceted, well-cut gems with unique brilliance that usually make up pieces of fine jewelry, such as precious metal rings and necklaces. However, nature doesn't produce these faceted and cut gems. So for a gemstone hunter like you to be successful in your search, you must learn to recognize the natural and physical characteristics of the gemstone in order to identify these rubies in their raw and natural form. Not only that, but as a bonus, I'll show you how to identify possible host rocks for these gems. Natural rubies are first formed by nature over thousands of years through specific geological processes. So the characteristics of the gem itself are very stable. For this reason, ruby is considered by many to be the king of gemstones, both in terms of people's admiration and in terms of its value. So the existence of natural ruby is a rare treasure of nature. In other words, consider yourself lucky if you find one lying around. But lest there be any misunderstandings, I'm going to clear up some classic doubts about rubies, such as how to identify natural rubies, what are the unique characteristics of rubies, and what distinguishes rubies from other gemstones, so that you can identify a rough, uncut ruby. Let's begin our adventure today by identifying a ruby in its natural state. Incredibly, identifying a rough ruby is easier than identifying a cut ruby, mainly due to the large number of synthetic rubies available on the gem market. But in general, a natural ruby has a flat, hexagonal shape. If the uncut gem has these characteristics, along with fragments of the host rock, such as marble or alkaline basalt, it is very likely to be a genuine ruby. In addition, the rough ruby may have an intense red color and sometimes small inclusions that don't detract from its natural beauty. These details are essential for recognizing a genuine ruby in its rough state. Most of the time, however, you'll end up with rubies of very poor quality, useful only for industrial purposes or as souvenirs of your adventures in the wild. But does that mean it's the end and you should give up? Of course not. On the contrary, finding low-quality rubies is a great green light. So if you continue your search, sooner or later you will find a good quality ruby. However, you may have problems identifying a rough ruby based on natural formation alone, as they don't always form like this with well-defined sides. Nature almost never makes anything uniform, especially gemstones, most of which form in the midst of a dense, overheated paste of various chemical elements, making inclusions and strange shapes very common in these gems. In some places, such as Sri Lanka, rubies are found in water-worn pebbles, making identification by the original shape of the crystal almost impossible. But despite being worn and broken by the forces of nature over time, they can still be found in their original characteristic form. For this reason, searching for these gems in nature and developing contact with examples of this mineral, either in its physical form or through videos and images, is essential to gain the experience necessary to make a definitive identification of the stone. Unfortunately, this takes time and months of practice. But fortunately, there are other ways to identify these gems, and one of them is to check for inclusions.
These browny red ones here is actually, these are well-formed rutile crystals, or rutile, depending on how you say it.
There is a test known as the mineral streak test, which should not be used on faceted rubies because it can scratch the polish of the gem. This test is therefore intended for uncut gems where the surface can be worn away without any problem. To better understand the ruby identification test, let's simplify the process. You will need an unglazed black or white porcelain plate. First, drag the gem across the plate. Then look at the stripe that remains. If the gemstone is a true ruby, it won't leave a colored stain because its red color is caused by traces of chromium and is not part of its basic chemical structure. If there is a colored patch, the stone is not a ruby. Rubies have a hardness of 9 on the Mohs scale. The porcelain plate only scratches stones with a hardness of 6 or less. Therefore, this test eliminates stones that are softer than a ruby. You can also use other gemstones such as topaz, which has a hardness of 8 on the Mohs scale, and quartz, which has a hardness of 7 on the Mohs scale. If the ruby scratches these materials easily, this is a sign that it is genuine, as only diamonds with a hardness of 10 Mohs or other rubies can scratch them. Try these techniques in combination to better identify a genuine ruby. Ruby buyers and cutters often use a variety of these identification techniques to check gemstones, especially their appearance and inclusions. Experienced dealers rarely find evidence that contradicts their first impression of well-formed rubies and can quickly check them. However, buyers should always be aware of a few factors. For example, be wary of large, extremely transparent rubies, especially if they are cheap, as they are likely to be synthetic. Natural rubies with these characteristics are extremely expensive and come with documentation from accredited gemological laboratories that you can contact for verification. The ruby is a gemstone that can be identified by several categories, starting with the color of the ruby, which is determined by the amount of chromium it contains. The more chromium, the more intense the color. The most famous example is the pigeon blood ruby found in Myanmar, which has the purest red known due to its high chromium content. The color of rubies can vary from pink to deep red, purple, and intense red, increasing in value as the color intensifies. In addition, high-quality rubies weighing more than 1 carat are rare. Ruby rings are usually around 1 carat, while necklaces or larger pieces of jewelry can be larger, depending on your needs. Once the gemological quality has been assessed, the type of cut and polish can further increase the value of the ruby. Transparency is another unique characteristic of rubies. Categories include transparent, semi-transparent, translucent, semi-translucent, semi-opaque, and opaque. Transparent rubies are ideal and of high quality, but are extremely rare due to the natural inclusions and cracks that occur during the formation of the gem. Most mined rubies have some degree of imperfection. Dichroism is another interesting characteristic of rubies, because you can observe 2 similar colors in these gems when exposed to ultraviolet light. This last tip is very useful if you're looking for rubies in the wild, because all you need to perform this test is an ultraviolet flashlight, which between you and me is very cheap and accessible. What's more, if you didn't know, rubies belong to the corundum family, and just for curiosity's sake, the name corundum comes from the Sanskrit word kurubindang, which means sapphire ruby. So the name corundum refers to 2 gems that are closely related because they are the same thing. So if you find rubies in a river, for example, you may well end up finding sapphires, because the only difference between a ruby and a sapphire is their color. While ruby represents red stones, sapphire represents all other colors. But in theory, they are the same mineral. Also, since all corundum is a very dense mineral, if you find one, you'll notice that it's much heavier than an ordinary stone of the same size. So let us know in the comments what country you're observing from, and if you want to find out if there are rubies and sapphires in the rivers in your region. Of course, other more specific characteristics, such as refraction and identification methods, are more in-depth topics in the field of gemology. Thanks for liking and subscribing. Good luck, gem hunter.